Okay, good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Pamela Scott. I'm the program director for the Westerly Historical Society. So I get to introduce myself. I put together the programs, and of course, please contact me at any time and let me know what you'd like to hear. I'm always open to suggestions on talks, subject matter. And of course, we're all interested in today's topic. This should be quite fun. I'm so glad you came today. I'm going to be talking about the William Clark Company Threadmill down the street in Pawcatuck. I'm very excited about this. This was kind of a surprise, something I wasn't really planning to work on, but I have some vested interest in this, as you will hear. Everywhere we drive in New England, we see mills. If you're on 95, if you're just going through town, going through the North End, on the Pawcatuck River, there are old mill buildings. You can't help but see our mills. And we have famous ones in our area. Slater Mill, if you haven't been there in Pawcatuck, you need to go. It's so important. It is important to the mills and manufacturing in the United States. When Henry Slater came to this country from England, he was a master at mills, and they would not give him any plans. It was proprietary. So he memorized everything, came to the US, and built the first mill from memory, and it's our Slater Mill. You need to go. It's very important. The Lowell Mill in Massachusetts, I've been up there. It's fascinating. I had no idea the conditions, and it wasn't just people going to a mill to work. A lot of these people were brought in to work in the mills, and Lowell is a real interesting example of a residential mill village. And of course, we have mills right here, and this is our Wall Dogs recent entry for Wall Dogs. It's down in Pawcatuck. If you haven't seen it, it's on the side of a building, and it shows the mills. And of course, whenever you travel, you can look for historic places in your destination, wherever you're going. I just went to Nashville, and I could look up ahead of time at this website all kinds of historic places I might visit. So this is something you want to definitely check out. Back to mills. My daughter moved into a mill a couple of years ago in Tiverton, and this is absolutely fascinating. This particular mill was built in 1881, and even though it's in Tiverton, it's closely associated to the Fall River Cotton Mill, glutton, really. It's quite condensed. It was built with locally quarried granite. Operations began in 1883 with 500 employees. This is very typical in size to the mill building we'll be talking about here later. This particular mill was primarily weaving and spinning operations, cotton and flannel goods. By 1900, it was producing 17 million yards of cloth a year. Phenomenal. Rhode Island and Massachusetts were very important in the textile industry. We were the main source for the southern raw goods. The southern raw goods came up to Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and this is why. I want to talk a little bit about them. This is a picture of the mill, born mill workers, And in their restored mill, which is now apartments, they have a nice hallway of black and white photographs of the mills and the mill workers, the machinery. It's really beautifully done. They've done a really nice job on this. And another reason to talk about mills, my ancestors came from Manchester. Manchester, England was known for the textile mills. In 1851, the population was 400,000, second only to London. By 1900, the population had grown to 700,000, and it was all mills. You can see how densely built they were. These mills in Manchester paid relatively high wages, so young people came in from the neighboring farms and villages to work in the mills, and they hired children, so families were really attracted. This influx of people and mill development in Manchester created city planning, what we know now as city planning. And at this time, my family came to America and came to Pawcatuck to work in the mills. And again, not unlike Manchester, Pawcatuck developed their mills in a very densely populated area. Okay, and I will also talk briefly. My mother's mother worked in the mills in Pawcatuck, and this is the 1920 census. She got married in 1921 at 19 years old, and she worked in the cotton mill. And it's kind of hard to read, but she did something with carding the cloth, carding the raw goods in the cotton mill, and that's what that is about. But this is her census record. And also, I have another distant relative on my mother's side who worked later as a union rep at the Clark Mill in Stonington, which is unusual coming all the way from Pawcatuck, but it was interesting to see that link, and it's actually in his census record. Now, jumping to our mill, let's talk about Westerly. This is right before the Clark Mill was built. Westerly was wealthy. When Rhode Island published a description of wealth and industry across the state in 1890, it talked about Westerly as one of the 5 cities that really contributed to the state's wealth. This town generated over $1 million in gross revenues, a lot of it coming, of course, from the granite industry. They were, as it talks about, the number of banks, 2 weekly papers, 10 churches, a high school, a library, and an opera house. These are all measures of a very wealthy community. And the manufacture in 1890, look at what's being manufactured. And of course, we know about the carriages from Watch Hill, and we know about flour, proprietary medicines, building materials, including granite. This was a very, very wealthy community, very attractive for additional mills. These photographs are from the Stonington Historical Society. They just acquired them, and they're really remarkable. This particular one shows Watch Hill. This is Westerly, and here's our mode of transportation in 1900. This is with the mill being built, this is what the conditions would be like if you were working at this time, if you were living in Westerly. These are what the harbor looked like, the boats. And this is the dress, the garments we'd be wearing on the street if we were living at this time. Now, there's been a lot of studies on the numbers of mills on the Pawcatuck River, and the Clark thread mill being on the lower Pawcatuck is indicated by the arrow, and there are some other older mills at the top of the map. Slightly above it would be the Stillman Mill, and above that, of course, White Rock. So there are several mills on the river. Let's see, one of the things, here's our White Rock Mill. I love this picture. It looks the same. And these are also pictures of mill buildings on the lower Pawcatuck. And this is very, these mills have all been, the particular one in White Rock that I showed just here, this was built, see it says 1849, 1877. These are much, much earlier mills than the Clark Mill, which we're going to talk about next. This Clark Mill, let's talk about William Clark. He ran a mill in Newark, and there were labor strikes in some of the other states. Labor unions and strikes didn't come to this area until the 30s, till Connecticut and Rhode Island. So, but Newark, New Jersey was hit with them early, and in 1890, William Clark was in deep trouble. He had a strike with nothing being made. He came up here to Stonington, most likely because of his connections with the Atwood machinery, which made machinery for textile mills, and he worked with the Atwoods and knew about Stonington and was able to acquire property on Mechanic Street the following year. So that would have been 1891. It was a standard mill construction with a flat roof. A lot of buildings at the time had attics, and fires were a big problem. And in order to minimize fire activity, a flat roof was more desirable. This particular mill that was built is one of the earliest examples in New England, in all of New England, of a mill powered by steam engines, fueled by coal, brought up the Pawcatuck River, and unloaded right across the street. So right there, it was really remarkable. I guess one of the things I want to talk about also is river access. The mills went on the Pawcatuck River because it was fast. You've seen it tidal, you've seen it up and down. It's quite rapid. This is great for mills. They added dams and other types of waterways. If you go to Wilmantic, you'll see canals, small canals built on the side of the river to help force the water in a faster method to be able to help the mill. But the Pawcatuck River had its own geographical features that worked great. This is why the mills were so successful here. Being steam-powered was very progressive at the time. Steam-powered engines in a mill afforded more product to be produced. It changed the face of the Industrial Revolution, steam-powered engines. And this particular mill was really ahead of its time. Who were they? Why did they came here? Their father was from the thread industry, and he was one of several, the William Jr., or William C. And William Clark was the person who was sent to America pretty much to avoid the reason they built in America was because of the high tariffs and importing fees that the United States was applying to goods made overseas. So they decided to build in America, and he built in Newark and then came to Stonington. And this is William Clark, who came to Stonington. And he, William Clark, came to Stonington, built the mill. His son stayed on and ran the mill, and he lived on Elm Street. And he had 3 children, and they were all born here in Westerly. And these are the William Jr. and his wife and the 3 children. And the first part of the mill was building number 1. This photo, this is from the Westerly Public Library. This was in 1895. Now, here are our mills. So here's our mill schematic. So this is building number 1. Building number 2 followed it. Boiler room, powerhouse, and the drying, dyeing concerns. These buildings were all built pretty much prior to 1900, 1905. These buildings were as you see. This particular picture, I love this picture, came from that images book, that Watch Hill Images book. I don't know if any of you have that, but it shows a 3-masted schooner right here at the Clark Mill dock. And most likely it brought up raw goods, people, that kind of thing, right here to the dock area. This is where the marina is now. Across is Margin Street. And there was a little ferry that came back and forth from that point area. This is really marvelous, a marvelous photograph.
Do you know the date on that photograph?
About 1895, this one. I don't think so. Margin Street, the white one might be on the left. That one might be. Pretty amazing. What else do I have? Here's our mill photo from 1900. Again, this is back to that Stonington collection, Stonington Historical Society collection of photographs. And this is from Coates and Clark. This is very typical of the inside of a thread mill. And I wanted you to see what the conditions were like. The machines machinery to put the thread on spools were all back to back. I mean, it was a very tight room, but the windows were large to let the light in because the workers had to see what was going on. They also had compressed work schedules because of daylight. So obviously in the summer you'd have more working time, and in the winter you'd have less hours because the days were shorter. Because a lot of the work was done in the spring, summer, fall months, those were farming times. And this was, Rhode Island was an agriculture state, and mills had a conflict. So a lot of women and children went to work in the mills because men were working on the farms. And there was a bit of a disconnect with society because of this draw in workforce. As I said, the raw materials came from the south. They came by rail and barge. During war times, these goods were smuggled to the north, so there was never a slowdown in production, particularly in Rhode Island. The carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving, and finishing of cloth and other goods were all done in Rhode Island mills. And that's pretty much it on this particular. I want to talk more about the history of the thread mill. The sale to American Thread, this is interesting. It kept its name as the William Clark Thread Mill. However, American Thread bought it in 1901. In 1900, American Thread they formed a separate division and bought several thread mills, and we're talking about 15 or more, and this is in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And they developed a monopoly with American Thread with its English counterpart. And in 1915, the federal government sued them for monopolizing the industry, and forced them to break up. And this is an interesting thing that happened because in 1901 it was obvious that they were buying up these thread mills and they were trying to control it. However, the federal government said no. So interesting to hear about that. World War One, there were about 600 workers in the mill at the time. I have a note here also about the hurricane. I think the hurricane's pretty important because what happened here, and this, I actually found this book downstairs in my walk-in closet. I was quite surprised. It's now on my bookshelf. It's now on my bookshelf because I didn't realize I had a copy, but there's copies here, there's copies in the library as well. But there are all kinds of pictures about Westerly and the vicinity, surrounding towns, and the damage and the stories of people that survived. And as you can see, both mill buildings 1 and 2, and the surrounding, that's one of the boiler buildings, damaged. It's not just the roof, but the top floors were damaged. And the owners of the building, of the mill, decided not to repair it. And they decided to sell it to local investors after the 1938 hurricane, which is a sad thing because this ended what we see as the textile mill and its use as a textile mill here in Pawcatuck. The Clarks. So what happened to the Clarks? The Clarks that ran the mill, William Jr. and his wife Ada, and his daughter Janet, are buried here in the river bend, and this is a beautiful Celtic cloth. And if you look up the river the way I have the photograph, you can actually see the marina, and behind it is the mill. It was the closest he could get being here in Westerly. He lived on Elm Street. He wanted to be buried in Riverbend, and there he is looking at the mill, which is just marvelous. An interesting thing about the daughter Janet was 16 years old, and she was on the train that crashed in Bradford, that the train speaker, remember the fellow that came and spoke about the trains a couple years ago? He spoke about the Bradford crash. She was one of the fatalities, and it was his daughter, Janet, and she's buried here in the corner, which is another, it's a small world. So, decline of industrialization. This is really about the textile mills, but it's about all mills. What happened with pretty much the early 1900s, conditions were becoming poor. You had mostly women and children working, and at that time, they did some numbers. Less than half of Rhode Island school-age children were getting an education of any kind. They were working 54-hour weeks in the local mills. By 1920, there were competitions from other countries for fabrics. There were new fabric materials and also a general slowdown in world economies, and this contributed to depressing the textile industry in the U.S., and that's all of the U.S. By the 1930s, over 25% of Rhode Island textile mill workers were unemployed. So what I have here is someone's scrapbook with a mill building, an empty mill building, and that's very typical. That's what happened. And it happened to us, it happened to our neighbors, it happened to all the states, all pretty much at the same time. Now, what happened to the thread mill? It was sold to local investors after the '38 hurricane, and it was rented out to various businesses over the years. For World War II, the Thermos company, thermoses, moved in, and they did thermoses and lunch packs for the war effort. It was rented out to fabric makers. Royal typewriters came in at one point. But it became run down and a blight. And headlines from 2011, 2012, the old thread mill in Stonington cited for blight, should be torn down. The headlines were bad. But in late 2012, it was bought. Part of it was bought, but it was bought. And the funding for a $26 million project was not easily found, but it was. And they found money through the state, they found money from local banks, they found money from all different places, deciding that housing and some affordable housing mixed in, which is where they got the money, they could do this. Here it says financing came primarily from the State Department of Housing Competitive Housing Assistance for multifamily properties. That's really, they provide gap from the other places you would find funding. Now, just as the mill got funding, the recession hit. So there was a bit of a delay. So the neighbors weren't too happy about this. But here, this is the plan. These were the plans. The people that were deciding they could convert this into apartments, this was their vision, to take an old mill and convert it to mixed use, 58 rental units and retail space, bring affordable and market rate residences to the area. And there were challenges. There were definitely challenges, but at this time they got the mill listed on the Federal Historic Register. Now the Mechanic Street mill area was designated a historic area back in the 80s. So getting the mill itself designation, now people can find it on the register, they can come and see it. I mean, and you're able to get money to restore it. So here we have a start of construction in spring of 2014. It took 2 years and it was about 26 million. Now, so here we go. Here are the construction photos. These are the plans, the architectural plans for the Threadmill from the developer. They're called, POCO is their logo, and Crowley Architects is the architect, and that's the inside. This is the beginning. You gotta do some demo, right? I mean, this just, it looks rough. But here is one of the Crowley architects with the plans. And here he is looking, this is going to be it. Now, here we are today. Now, they opened November 16th, 2016. I don't know if any of you went to the open house. Apartments start at $1,400 a month. 30% of the 58 rental apartments are designated affordable housing, so they go for about half that for people in need. But as you can see, this is his site, and I will show you additional pictures. The apartments are in this section. This is still a mess. This is all ruined. They have a lot of work to do. It's not done. So here's the logo, and they came up with a cute little mill design on the T for Threadmill Apartments. It's not called the William Clark Company Threadmill anymore. It's called the Threadmill Apartments. It's a new building. And this is the front door, and this is what it looks like looking up into all the apartments. There's 4 floors of apartments. And when you go in, there's still some architectural details from the old brick, which is marvelous to see with the beautiful windows. And you can see again some of the old architectural marks plus new ones. You have to have exits. And this is one of the open areas from the looking. You can actually look down. It's really, really beautifully done. And this is a sample of, well, this is the hallway and this is someone's door. And what was, I guess it's disappointing, the floors are not the original floors. If you go to the Bourne Mill and other mills, they are able, some of them, at great expense, are able to treat the old oak floors and try and get the oil out and try and reuse the floors. These are other materials. They weren't able to save the floors at all. But the apartments are huge. I was telling some of the attendees earlier, they're just beautiful indoor apartments. They have this U-shaped kitchen. There's an office area off one side, 2 huge bedrooms, walk-in closets, bathrooms that are as big as the kitchen. Just huge, huge spaces. That's one of the smaller bathrooms. The one I saw was massive. They have a few common areas like the mail and the garbage chutes, and it's a small gym upstairs, but there aren't the common areas that I've seen in other mill buildings. So that was the only really disappointing feature. This is the outside restored area of the brick with the apartments. And from the roof, and you can see the new flat roof and the view at the Pawcatuck River and the marina. Really, 4th floor and on the riverside, you really have some beautiful views. Now, this is a section that is not restored. You can see the apartments on the left, but on the whole right section in the tower is still in rough shape, broken windows. This is still, you can see where the restored part is on the left. The whole section you're looking at is really rough. Now there's 3 owners. The owner that did the apartments has done a beautiful job. The other 2 owners, I don't know. I don't know what their plans will be for the building. Hopefully they will do something with it. It's just, it would be nice to see the whole thing done. It really would. And I'm sure the neighbors aren't happy about this at all. Now, Stonington approved 3 projects. The Connecticut casting mill, which I'm not sure where it is, but it's got to be close. And of course the Mystic Color Lab, which we all have driven by. That'll be amazing, but it just looks so rough right now, but it's still. Now, these are my list of references. Again, I had probably more fun looking up this information than in putting it together. I went everywhere for this. This was, then there are some real gem materials upstairs in this library. In the, yes, Gloria wrote an article. We now have her papers as part of our archives, by the way. There are other, the British Library had some wonderful things online, and the Images of America series, the Watch Hill book is wonderful. I was very fortunate. I was able to get a hold of the submission documents for historic preservation for the mill, and those were really detailed, really amazing. And the Stonington Historical Society, again, great things. And that is my talk. I think I kind of went through pretty quickly, but hopefully you enjoyed the photographs and enjoyed the research. Thank you. And do you have any questions?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to call on him first. Go ahead.
Me?
Yes. Sure.
Did you find any pictures of the mills in the middle of town? The ones along the river on Main Street?
I did not, but I wasn't looking for them.
Oh.
I was really looking for the Clark Mill, and of course got a bit sidetracked with the family, but tried to stay with the Clark Mill, but there's so much mill history here in town. Yes?
Two questions. In the plan for the restoration you showed, it talked about 9,000 square feet of retail spaces. Any of that come to fruition yet?
No, not yet.
And my other question is, you said that some of it is low-income housing. Is that HUD subsidized housing?
I don't know because it's Connecticut. I'm not sure. I know when you fill out the application, you would apply in a different manner, but I just don't know what that is. They were very forthcoming, though, talking to the people at the developers, that they got all their information for their historic commission submission from the Stonington Historical Society. So I really was pleased that I was able to go there and see their vertical files and all the documents. Yes?
I just want to say that Connecticut casting went into that mill that's on Stone Avenue.
Oh, okay.
And that was about 60 years ago, because I can remember them going in there, and the company didn't stay all that long. It was Connecticut casting and then Stone Avenue.
Okay, good. I'll have to definitely look that up. Yes?
Couple of questions. You indicated they were in Scotland. Do you know what part of Scotland?
Paisley, Scotland, and I don't know where Paisley is. They had a huge concern. Good.
Okay.
If you go to their, I have a Ancestry Global account, and there's tons of documents from Scotland on Ancestry about the Clarks. I'm just amazed at what they did there.
That's the other part is that one of your pictures actually had Colts and Clarks.
Yes,
Which was the big company in Paisley.
yes.
And
That was the later name.
that was its own. And you have Clark here. And was that Clark that was here part of the Colts and Clark? Because
Not from,
Colts and Clark was behind American Thread.
right, but not from what I understand. American Thread and the Coates and Clark firm were English, and I don't think Coates and Clark were the same Clark family that came from Paisley, that is the Clark Mill. Yes.
The Clarks, the Rhode Island Clarks, go back to the 1600s. So I work in most of this department.
There you go. There you go.
But the Clarks go back to the 1600s, and these guys came from England. There might be connections someplace along the way, but
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like the same crowd.
It didn't sound like it to me when I heard they came from Paisley, and they went to Newark, the big concern in Newark, and then a few William Clark, one of the sons, and also one of his brothers, Robert, came here and worked in this mill. Robert graduated from Princeton, and I actually have his in 1882, and I have his Princeton death record from their publication that talked about the Clark Mill. But they were from Newark. They weren't from this area. But it was really interesting to head down to Riverbend and see the cross. It was not the big one on the drive. It was down by the water, looking at the mill. And it was just remarkable. What a location. Yes, Ellen?
Pam, did you find any records of any fires in that building?
Yes. But not, there were fires more recently. Once they started building apartments, there were fires. But I didn't find any then, in the past, but the section of the Westerly Sun that's indexed back then, because I was looking between 1892 and 1938, the Westerly Sun indexed and the Narragansett Weekly, which were the two papers at the time that are indexed at the library. The indexing is very rudimentary, and I really wasn't finding. I found a few articles that talked about consolidation of some of the mills in the area, but not anything specific on the William Clark and fires. But it couldn't have been a safe environment. I just can't see it. It must have been very dangerous.
Yeah, well, I mean, with what they had to fight fires with back in that era, if a thread mill with all that thread and dust caught fire, it would probably burn to the ground.
Well, that's it.
I think the last fire in there was like 3 years ago when it was vacant. The pot, it's, it's all broken apart now.
Right, that's what I was starting to mention to Ellen. That's the part that was in the paper, the Westerly Sun recently. It was about 3 years ago.
The fire marshal made them clear, there's nothing in there now.
Right.
Because they don't have a sprinkler system and they can't keep it heated in the wintertime, so the
Right.
sprinkler system is no good.
This is the section of the mill that is
Right.
not apartments, it's the other. Right, there are other.
Did they each buy a section of it?
Yeah, it's actually 3 sections.
The property that's all done over,
Yeah.
you got the funds, because of the one owner. And then there was 2 owners that own the section that's not done. And I was told that section, those 2 owners paid $143,000 for that property. But when the guy got the other money, they wanted like $2 million, and he wasn't gonna pay $2 million for it. So now it's up in the air, but just recently I was talking to one of the fire marshals in Pawcatuck, and they made him clean everything out of there, and then he handed it over to the state fire marshal, so there's nothing in there anymore, on the broken down part,
Yeah.
What
Yes,
are the
yes.
names of the other 2 places that are being restored?
Connecticut Casting and Mystic Color Lab. And they were both approved by the town of Stonington for restoration and renovation. Yes.
The apartments that are there now, are they for sale or just for rent?
For rent.
Do you have any idea how many of them have gotten rented?
They're full. There's a waiting list.
I lived down at 304 Road.
Yeah.
And, when you go by there, my wife and I have counted that sometimes you go by there at 9 o'clock at night, in the back and in the front, there's going to be 7,500 cars there, so they're all taken.
Yeah.
That's good, they didn't.
There is a waiting list, yeah. But they are beautiful apartments. Yeah.
Fall River, I used to drive up there back like in the 60s to visit,
Yeah.
the early 70s. And one of the old mills, not too far off the highway there, they converted into senior housing, and it was beautiful,
Oh, yeah.
all redone. The
Yep.
old building, brick, beautiful window.
It would be a great source of housing. I know we even are shy on housing in our town, and we have a lot of mill buildings, and, it just takes some money to do
One
it.
thing, when you get on the train and go out to New York from here, you see all those vacant
Oh, yeah.
brick buildings. So sad.
Yep. Yep. Amazing. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you. Our next program is March. I believe it's March 25th. And one of the things I noticed other historical societies do is they have days where you can go through the properties that they are affiliated with, and our program is going to be at the Babcock Smith House in March. So please come. Plan to go next door. We'll be having lectures by Tony Smith and Ed Fazio, and we'll be wandering through the Babcock Smith house and seeing what's new. I believe the stairwell has been rebuilt, or is being rebuilt, so I'm really anxious to see some of the work still being worked on. So I'm anxious to see some of the things that have been going on next door, but it should be a lot of fun.